To speak of the education of the child from a Steiner-inspired perspective means, first of all, to shift our gaze away from abstract methods and toward the living being who stands before us. The child is not a blank slate nor a miniature adult to be shaped according to social expectations. The child is a soul and spirit who has entered earthly existence with a long history behind them and a future task ahead of them. Education, in this sense, is not an act of molding, but an act of accompaniment. The adult is called to read with reverence and responsibility what is seeking to unfold through the child. Steiner emphasizes that human development proceeds in lawful rhythms, especially in the 7-year periods that shape childhood and youth. In the first 7 years, the child is primarily a being of imitation. Everything that surrounds the child, gestures, tone of voice, emotional atmosphere, even the unspoken moral quality of the adults, imprints itself deeply into the physical and etheric organization. Education at this stage does not work through explanation or moralizing, but through example. What the adult is, not what the adult says, becomes formative. The child learns the world by absorbing it bodily, rhythmically, and unconsciously. From this perspective, the greatest educational responsibility in early childhood lies in the self-education of the adult. The educator's inner life, their truthfulness, their capacity for calm and warmth works directly into the child's growing organism. Disorder, nervousness, or moral inconsistency do not remain external. They become forces that the child must later overcome inwardly. Thus, Steiner speaks of creating a healthy environment not merely in a hygienic sense, but in a soul-spiritual sense. Regular rhythms, meaningful repetition, and a sense of security form the invisible architecture within which the child's will can take root. With the change of teeth, a significant transformation occurs. The etheric body, previously devoted to shaping and sustaining the physical organism, becomes increasingly available for memory, imagination, and learning. This marks the second 7-year period, in which the child naturally seeks authority, not authority imposed through power, but authority grounded in love and inner certainty. The child does not yet want to judge the world independently. Rather, they want to experience that the world is meaningful because trusted adults stand within it with confidence and moral orientation. Education in this phase works through images, stories, and living pictures. Abstract concepts dry out the soul prematurely. Steiner repeatedly warns against addressing the intellect too early, as this draws forces away from the proper development of feeling and will. What the child needs now is not critical thinking, but a deepened relationship to beauty, meaning, and moral imagination. Through such experiences, the astral body prepares itself for later independence. Throughout all stages, Steiner reminds us that education is always a delicate balance between freedom and guidance. The child must not be forced prematurely into self-consciousness, nor should they be kept in dependency longer than is healthy. The task of education is to recognize what is ripening and to refrain from awakening what must still sleep. In this restraint lies true pedagogical wisdom. In this light, education becomes a profoundly moral and spiritual task. It is not oriented toward producing useful citizens or efficient workers, but toward supporting the incarnation of a free human being. Each child carries something unique that has never been on earth before and will never appear again in the same way. To educate is to protect this uniqueness while gently helping it find its place in the human community. As the child continues to grow, Steiner draws attention to the fact that education must increasingly work with the soul life rather than directly upon the body. In the second 7-year period, feeling becomes the central mediator between willing and thinking. The child now lives strongly in the realm of sympathy and antipathy, joy and sorrow, enthusiasm and disappointment. Education that ignores this soul reality risks becoming either mechanical or oppressive. The educator's task is to shape the child's emotional life in such a way that it remains flexible, truthful, and capable of deepening rather than hardening. Steiner emphasizes that the moral education of the child at this stage cannot be separated from aesthetic experience. Beauty, rhythm, music, poetry, and meaningful artistic activity speak directly to the feeling life and create inner order without coercion. When the child experiences beauty regularly, moral impulses arise naturally. Right action is then felt as something harmonious, not imposed. In contrast, moral instruction that relies on rules and admonitions addresses the intellect prematurely and often produces resistance or inner emptiness. Another crucial aspect of this developmental phase is the role of authority. Steiner uses this word carefully, aware of its potential for misunderstanding. True authority, in his sense, is not domination, but a natural consequence of trust. The child looks up to the educator because the educator embodies coherence between word and deed. Such authority provides orientation at a time when the child cannot yet rely on independent judgment. Where this authority is lacking or inconsistent, the child's soul life becomes insecure, often manifesting later as doubt, rebellion, or excessive dependence on external approval. Steiner also highlights the importance of teaching through living connections rather than isolated facts. Knowledge should be presented as something that grows out of the world, not as information detached from life. When lessons are woven into stories, images, and human meaning, they nourish the child's inner life. The soul then feels addressed as a whole. This holistic approach prepares the ground for later intellectual clarity without sacrificing inner warmth. Discipline, from this perspective, is not about control, but about helping the child find inner order. Clear boundaries are necessary, yet they must arise from understanding rather than fear. Steiner insists that punishment which humiliates or frightens damages the child's relationship to authority and undermines trust in the world. Corrective guidance, when given calmly and consistently, strengthens the child's sense of security and moral orientation. The child learns that the world is lawful, but not hostile. During this period, the child also begins to develop a sense of time and responsibility. Tasks that can be completed, repeated, and gradually mastered support the growing will. Steiner stresses that perseverance is not taught through pressure, but through experiences that allow success to grow organically. When the child feels capable, the will strengthens naturally. Where constant comparison or premature evaluation dominates, the will often retreats or becomes defensive. Education at this stage therefore demands patience and inner attentiveness from the adult. One must resist the temptation to accelerate development for the sake of measurable outcomes. Steiner reminds us that what is hurried in childhood often demands painful correction later in life. True education prepares the soul not only for knowledge, but for resilience, moral sensitivity, and the capacity to meet life with confidence. In the next phase, as the child approaches adolescence, education must once again transform its approach. The emergence of independent thinking brings new challenges and responsibilities, which we will consider in the following section. As the child approaches adolescence, a profound inner shift takes place. Steiner describes this period as one of awakening, but also of vulnerability. The astral body enters more fully into the human organization, bringing with it heightened sensitivity, emotional intensity, and the first stirrings of independent judgment. What was previously accepted on the basis of trust now begins to be questioned. The young person no longer wishes merely to receive the world, they seek to understand it and to find their own place within it. Education must meet this awakening with tact and honesty, or it risks losing the young person inwardly. At this stage, Steiner emphasizes that education must increasingly appeal to the young person's sense of truth. Any form of pretense, manipulation, or unacknowledged authority is keenly perceived and often rejected. Adolescents are extraordinarily sensitive to contradiction between words and deeds. Where adults demand obedience without offering understanding, resistance hardens. Where adults admit uncertainty yet remain sincere, trust can deepen on a new level. The educator must now transform authority into partnership without relinquishing responsibility. Thinking, which was previously nourished indirectly through images and stories, now seeks clarity and coherence. Steiner does not oppose intellectual rigor at this stage. On the contrary, he insists that adolescents need to experience thinking as something that can illuminate the world rather than reduce it. Teaching should now guide the young person toward lawful relationships, inner connections, and meaningful concepts. Yet even here, abstraction must be enlivened. Thinking should arise out of lived experience, observation, and inner participation, so that it remains connected to reality rather than becoming empty or cynical. The emotional life during adolescence often oscillates between enthusiasm and despair. Steiner sees this not as pathology, but as an expression of the soul's struggle to find balance between ideals and reality. Education must not suppress this struggle, nor exploit it. Instead, it should provide forms through which feeling can be articulated and transformed. Artistic activity, dialogue, and meaningful work allow emotions to become conscious without overwhelming the young person. In this way, feeling becomes a bridge rather than an obstacle to understanding. Steiner also stresses the importance of addressing moral questions openly during this phase. Adolescents are not content with inherited values. They want to know why something is right or wrong. Moral education must therefore move from example to reflection. This does not mean imposing opinions, but creating space for genuine questioning. Where moral ideals are presented as living challenges rather than fixed answers, the young person can begin to develop an inner moral compass. Another crucial task of education in adolescence is to support the development of social responsibility. The young person gradually awakens to the reality of others as independent beings. Group work, shared projects, and encounters with real human needs help transform self-centered idealism into social awareness. Steiner warns that when young people are cut off from meaningful social engagement, their ideals may turn inward and become destructive. Throughout this phase, the educator must practice a delicate balance between guidance and freedom. Too much control stifles the emerging I. Too little guidance leaves it unprotected. The art of education lies in recognizing when to step forward and when to step back. What the young person needs most is not perfection from adults, but authenticity and moral courage. As adolescence draws toward its close, the foundations are laid for independent judgment and responsibility. Education has fulfilled its task when the young person begins to sense that freedom is not the absence of guidance, but the capacity to guide oneself. In the final section, we will consider how Steiner understands the ultimate aim of education and the responsibility it places upon adults and society as a whole. When Steiner speaks of the ultimate aim of education, he makes it unmistakably clear that it does not lie in the transmission of knowledge, nor in social adaptation, nor even in success, as it is commonly understood. The true aim of education is the gradual awakening of the free human being. Freedom, however, is not something that can be granted from outside. It must grow organically from the whole course of development. Education either prepares the ground for this growth or it obstructs it. There is no neutral position. As the young person approaches adulthood, the task of education increasingly shifts from shaping to releasing. What has been nurtured through imitation, guided through authority, and clarified through understanding must now be entrusted to the individual. Steiner emphasizes that this moment requires courage from the educator. One must be willing to let go, even at the risk of error. Freedom includes the possibility of mistake, and an education that seeks to prevent all error ultimately undermines moral strength. The young adult must be allowed to test themselves against life in order to truly claim their own judgment. At this stage, education becomes less about instruction and more about orientation. The educator's role is no longer to stand in front, but beside. Conversations replace directives. Shared inquiry replaces explanation. What the young person now needs most is not answers, but companions who take truth seriously and are willing to stand by it. Steiner insists that the deepest educational influence at this point lies in the adult's relationship to truth, responsibility, and inner work. Young people sense immediately whether ideals are lived or merely spoken. Steiner also places the responsibility for education not only on individual teachers or parents, but on society as a whole. A culture that contradicts its educational ideals through injustice, exploitation, or cynicism undermines everything education seeks to accomplish. The young person must encounter a world that, though imperfect, is at least striving toward truth and human dignity. Otherwise, education becomes an isolated effort fighting against overwhelming counterforces. The spiritual dimension of education now becomes fully visible. Each human being enters life with a task that cannot be reduced to profession or social role. Education serves this task by helping the individual recognize their own responsibility toward the world. Steiner speaks of education as a service to humanity's future because each child carries impulses that may become decisive for what lies ahead. To educate responsibly is therefore to act not only for the present, but for generations yet to come. In this light, education becomes an act of hope grounded in realism. It acknowledges human weakness without surrendering to it. It trusts in freedom without abandoning guidance. Above all, it recognizes that the child is not the possession of parents, institutions, or the state, but a spiritual being on a path of becoming. To accompany this path with reverence, patience, and truthfulness is the highest calling of education. Thus, Steiner's view of education challenges both complacency and control. It asks adults to work continually on themselves, to remain inwardly alive, and to meet the child not with fixed concepts, but with an open, listening soul. Where this attitude lives, education becomes more than preparation for life. It becomes part of life's own unfolding, a quiet cooperation with the forces that seek to bring freedom, responsibility, and humanity into the world.